We now come to the debate on proposed reforms to the criminal justice system to better respond to families bereaved by public disasters. Maria Eagle to move.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I beg to move that this House has considered proposed reforms to the criminal justice system to better respond to families bereaved by public disasters. I thank the Backbench Business Committee for granting this debate, which is timely. It's about learning the lessons of the Hillsborough disaster so that never again will families bereaved by a public disaster have to endure the more than 3 decades long ordeal of the Hillsborough families. It's about changing the law to ensure that what's happened to them can never happen again to any families bereaved by public disaster. I want to begin by noting that since the final criminal trials arising out of Hillsborough collapsed in May, Mr Andrew Devine has sadly died, aged 55, as a direct result of the catastrophic injuries he received in the crush at Hillsborough in 1989. Liverpool coroner Andre Rebello has recorded a verdict of unlawful killing following his death. That verdict confirmed that Andrew Devine is the 97th victim of the Hillsborough disaster. Madam Deputy Speaker, it's only right that his name is read aloud and noted in this place, as were the other 96, read out by Steve Rotherham, the former member for Liverpool Walton, in a debate in the House in 2011. Hillsborough was a national disaster, not just a disaster affecting Liverpool, not just a disaster affecting football, and the lessons to be learned are applicable far beyond the circumstances of Hillsborough itself.
Would the Honourable Lady give way on that point?
I will indeed.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm very grateful for the Right Honourable Lady giving way on that point, because I think she makes a really important point that obviously this debate is centred on Hillsborough, but the lessons from Hillsborough apply to other public disasters such as the contaminated blood scandal. And the people who've been infected and affected by the contaminated blood scandal stand in solidarity with what the Right Honourable Lady is proposing to do to make sure that no other family ever has to go through what the Hillsborough families have gone through.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I agree very much with what the Honourable Lady has said, and it's true that there is a much broader application for the lessons learned as they relate to other disasters. The last of the criminal trials relating to Hillsborough collapsed in May of this year, some 32 years after the actual event. It's surely a catastrophic failure of our criminal justice system that it could take so long whilst still failing so badly to do justice to those who died, their families, those injured and the traumatised survivors. There's something very wrong with how our legal system handles public disasters. So 32 years after 97 people were unlawfully killed at a football match, primarily through the gross negligence of the South Yorkshire Police, proven at the second inquests to a criminal standard of proof, no one has been held to account through our criminal justice system for these killings. For 32 years, those responsible for the disaster have sought to blame the victims and survivors for what happened and deny their own culpability. It took 23 years for the truth to be acknowledged, following the work of the Hillsborough Independent Panel in 2012. It was fortunate, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the panel was even set up to do its work following the 20th anniversary memorial event. Andy Burnham and I, as ministers in the Brown government, and with the permission of the Prime Minister, had earlier that day launched our joint call for all documentation relating to Hillsborough to be published to facilitate transparency. The Hillsborough Independent Panel was only established with the powers of a data controller because of the insight of Lord Michael Wills, then in charge of freedom of information in the MOJ. And it was only because of that formulation that the truth about what happened on that terrible day was finally able to be revealed incontrovertibly with documentation. And it was only because of the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead, who I'm glad to see in her place, that it was allowed to complete its work after the change in government in 2010. It would have been very easy to cancel it at that point, and she didn't, and for that she deserves great credit. It should also be noted that the Hillsborough Independent Panel was a non-legal process, and that it worked by making use of openness and transparency. As a consequence of its work, the original inquest verdicts of accidental death were quashed, but it took 27 years for correct inquest verdicts of unlawful killing to be recorded. Families had to fight for 23 years for the truth to be officially acknowledged, But to this day, no one has been held to account for the Hillsborough slurs and the decades-long smear campaign that was conducted by those responsible, the South Yorkshire Police, to deflect blame from themselves onto the innocent victims, the dead, the injured, the traumatised survivors. As Prime Minister at the time, David Cameron apologised to the families in 2012 for the smears they had endured over what was then a 23-year period. From that dispatch box, he said this: "These families have suffered a double injustice. The injustice of the appalling events, the failure of the state to protect their loved ones, and the indefensible wait to get to the truth, and the injustice of the denigration of the deceased, that they were somehow at fault for their own deaths. On behalf of the government, and indeed our country, I am profoundly sorry for this double injustice that has been left uncorrected for so long." That full and unequivocal apology was made 9 years ago. That should have put a stop to the self-serving lies by the representatives of those who were at fault, but it didn't. Since evidence began to be heard at the new inquest in April 2014, there have been legal proceedings that have required the families to maintain a public silence to avoid prejudicing them. Yet the apologists and defenders of the South Yorkshire Police and of the individuals responsible for what happened on that day have not been silent. They have reiterated the smears, for which the Prime Minister apologised to the families in 2012, and they've done so inside and outside the courtroom. We must change the law to stop this kind of cruel abuse perpetrated by a public authority using taxpayers' money over decades from ever happening again. Madam Deputy Speaker, we must stop legal proceedings arising out of disasters from lasting for decades and from going so wrong, because once things go this wrong, our legal system appears to find it very hard to put things right. We must give the collective voice of the bereaved families agency in the proceedings that inevitably follow a disaster. We must search for the truth using transparency as a key tool and not allow the legal forums to become a way for moneyed vested interests to set about evading their responsibility for disasters that they've caused. The Public Advocate Bill that I've introduced again into the House and that I've been doing for a number of years and that Lord Michael Wills has done in the Lords will do that. It's timely now to have this debate because I know that the government are now considering their response to Bishop James Jones's 2017 report into the lessons to be learned from Hillsborough, which was commissioned by the Right Honourable Lady, the member for Maidenhead. I hope that as part of the response to that, the Minister will agree to legislate for an independent public advocate. I know that the Right Honourable Gentleman, the member for Swindon South, was very sympathetic, and I'm sorry to see that he's lost his place in the government. I think that he was very sympathetic to this call. My bill seeks to put bereaved families collectively at the heart of the response to disasters through the establishment of an independent public advocate who, if the bereaved families wish it, will act as a representative for their interests, an advisor, a guide. The advocate as a data controller will be able to establish a panel like the Hillsborough Independent Panel to facilitate transparency about what has happened at an early stage. Crucially, it would give the families the capacity to decide collectively on an initiative that will put them at the heart of events, instead of feeling, as bereaved families often do, that they are a mere adjunct to proceedings. And this enforced transparency, shining a light into the darkest recesses of the reaction of public authorities caught up in disasters, would torpedo attempted cover-ups and do so at an early stage. Now, let me be clear, this role would not replace that of more traditional legal advocates, barristers, solicitors, who will continue to act for individuals in specific legal proceedings, but it would fulfil a different and additional role. The proposal would not require new institutional arrangements or place any burden on the Exchequer. It wouldn't require an open chequebook. On the contrary, the transparency it would bring could save millions of pounds in drawn-out adversarial proceedings over many years or decades. I'm pleased to have the support of many of the most prominent and active members of the Hillsborough Family Support Group who've written a letter published today in the Daily Mirror. And they say this: we are members of families bereaved by the Hillsborough disaster more than 32 years ago who've been active in the campaign for truth and justice. It took us 23 years of relentless campaigning to have the truth about what happened to our family members finally officially acknowledged. It took 27 years to get accurate inquest verdicts of unlawful killing. The collapse of the criminal trials in May means that after 32 years, no one responsible has been held to account by our criminal justice system for the unlawful killings of 97 innocent women, children and men. We do not want any other families to endure what we've had to go through simply because they're caught up in a disaster through no fault of their own. We believe that an independent public advocate, as proposed by Maria Eagle MP and Lord Michael Wills, would stop families bereaved by public disasters in future from ever having to go through what we've had to endure over the last 32 years. We know that the government of Theresa May consulted on establishing such an office in 2017, but the proposal appears to have been dropped by the current government. We hope that the Lord Chancellor will use the occasion of the debate in the House of Commons on the 16th of September to announce the creation of an independent public advocate, as promised in his 2017 manifesto. We consider such a change will be an important part of the legacy of the 97 and of our long and hard campaign for truth and justice. Now, as the government are considering their response to Bishop James' report, can I say I know that because he has told me that he's fully supportive of the establishment of an independent public advocate. He told me that he's been persuaded by his experience of meeting families involved in other disasters, such as Gosport and the Infected Blood scandal, that such a position is necessary. I'm very supportive of his own findings. 3 recommendations of his in particular are key: the proposed charter for families bereaved through public tragedy, equality of arms at inquests, and the statutory duty of candour. These measures are undoubtedly valuable, and the government should adopt them. However, I think the only way of preventing disasters going so catastrophically wrong over decades is to establish an independent public advocate. The families back this reform. Bishop James backs this reform. The party opposite had it in their manifesto in 2017. So I hope that all of us across the House can get behind it and legislate for it now. I was first elected to this House over 24 years ago on the 1st of May 1997. The first of my new constituents to contact me shortly after were the bereaved families of those who'd been killed in the Hillsborough disaster, then 9 years earlier than that. They had by that time already endured almost a decade of legal actions, including the Taylor inquiry, the first inquests, civil claims, decisions not to discipline or to prosecute the South Yorkshire Police commanders in charge on that day, judicial reviews of various such decisions, appeals, and every other kind of legal action imaginable, such that it seemed even then like there was little chance for further recourse for them through our legal system. I met with 4 of the Hillsborough Family Support Group Committee in the home of one of them in my constituency. I met Phil Hammond, who lost his son in the disaster and was then chair of the Hillsborough Family Support Group. I met Jenny Hicks, who lost both her daughters in the disaster. And we met in the home of Doreen Jones, who lost her son and his fiancée, and very nearly her daughter too. I also met Trevor Hicks, who was prominent then in the campaign. I was struck by the raw pain and deep anger of Phil Hammond. I still remember it now. It was like he was reliving the day of the disaster, like it had been yesterday, in minute detail as he talked. Yet this was 9 years on, and almost all possible legal avenues had already been tried and had failed the families in getting to the truth or achieving justice for the bereaved. He was so appalled and upset at the fact that he felt his young son, who had been killed, was being blamed for what had happened to him when he was a wholly innocent boy, and that those who were responsible, the South Yorkshire Police, were not intent upon telling the truth and learning lessons, as Lord Justice Taylor had exhorted them to do, but in the callous pursuit instead of blaming the victims of the tragedy, no matter what pain and hurt they caused in the process. Whilst we had a tea break at our meeting, I overheard Trevor Hicks telling Jenny that he'd been contacted by a new witness who perhaps had some information about one of their 2 young daughters and what had happened to her during the missing hours between them going into Leppings Lane and the confirmation that both of them had been killed. I was struck by the fact that this basic information was what the inquests were supposed to have provided to the grieving families, but the inquests came nowhere near to fulfilling that basic purpose. It wasn't until the second inquests began, a full 17 years after this meeting, that our legal system even tried to answer those questions for the bereaved families. I knew how wrong things had gone, how thoroughly the families had been let down. Their loved ones, Liverpool fans, the survivors, traduced, and I've tried to do all I can to help them and other families ever since. They've all been central figures in the Hillsborough family's fight for truth and justice, along with many others. But I want to take this opportunity to say that without their unbelievable efforts over so many years, the truth wouldn't have been acknowledged. The correct inquest verdicts wouldn't have been handed down. Their achievements and those of other families and representatives such as Margaret Aspinall, Sue Roberts, the indefatigable Anne Williams and others too numerous to mention are monumental. Their fortitude, their dignity, persistence, determination had to be seen to be believed. They've needed all of those qualities for all of the 32 and a half years that it's taken. This year, the Hillsborough Family Support Group has disbanded, knowing now they can do no more. They have the truth. They've achieved a measure of justice, but there's been no accountability. They have, between them all, truly done everything they possibly can for their lost loved ones. Now it's up to us, in this House, ministers, in this government, to learn the lessons that their commitment, their fortitude, their togetherness over such a long period have taught us. We owe it to them to get it right. We owe it to those 97 people unlawfully killed by the gross negligence of South Yorkshire Police on that day in 1989 to make sure that what has happened to these bereaved families and survivors can never happen again to families bereaved in public disasters. And there will be more disasters. There have been. The establishment of the Independent Public Advocate will help to do that. I call upon the Lord Chancellor, the Home Secretary, the Government, to heed those who really do know best. The Hillsborough families themselves use the occasion of this debate to announce that they will now do what they said they would in 2017, establish an office of the Independent Public Advocate. Now is the time to really move forward to implement those learned lessons of Hillsborough and at long last to change the law to prevent what went so wrong in that case from ever happening to any other families again.